The plague, a devastating infection that ravaged 14th century Europe, was incredibly brutal, wiping out possibly more than half the continent's population. Starting around 1347, the plague's rampage left bodies strewn in the streets, leaving Europe seemingly beyond recovery. Then, towards the end of the 14th century, this terrifying plague subsided, leaving behind a devastated world. So, what kind of lives did the people left in this ravaged world lead after the plague passed? Thinking about how life changed due to an infectious disease outbreak, we can relate to some aspects, like changes in work and relationships. But the societal changes after the Black Death were incomparably larger than anything we've seen in modern times. The plague cost Europe countless lives, but it also marked a huge historical turning point. Exploring this secret reveals how interwoven events are in shaping history. This time, let's look at just how significant the plague's impact on history truly was. Let's take a look at what life was like during the plague. The Black Death that swept across Europe in the 1340s killed a staggering 60% of the population. The Italian poet Petrarch described the devastation like this. Houses stood empty, cities were deserted, the countryside lay fallow, there wasn't even enough land to bury the dead, and fear and loneliness stalked the earth. And in that ravaged world, many who witnessed the deaths of family, friends, and neighbors were in the worst possible state of mind. In a letter to his brother, Petrarch lamented, "Brother, I wish I had never been born. I wish I had died before this time." His brother, one of only 35 monks to survive in his monastery, apparently didn't find that a cause for celebration, but rather a source of suffering. Petrarch also wrote, "Has anything like this ever happened before? Will future generations, blessed with ignorance of this misery, ever understand our suffering?" In other words, there was no comparable despair, either in the past or the future. It wasn't just the agonizing loneliness and guilt that the plague brought to the people of that time. The plague also had a huge impact on social and productive activities. For example, craftsmen closed their workshops while the plague raged, so goods weren't produced, and farmers abandoned their fields, leaving crops to rot. As a result, the next thing people faced was soaring food prices. Records from Florence, Italy, show that things like cakes, sugar, and chicken, foods considered suitable for the sick, became outrageously expensive. And it wasn't just food that suddenly became expensive. The cloth used to transport corpses before burial jumped tenfold in price. In a world ravaged by plague, shortages led to inflation, plunging the economy into crisis. Losing loved ones, racked with guilt, and facing increasingly difficult living conditions, it was a truly terrible situation. But finally, when the plague subsided and the population decline stopped, the times changed dramatically. Everywhere you looked, there were abandoned farmlands, but extremely few people to cultivate them. The world faced an overwhelming labor shortage, and a scramble for workers began. As a result, workers' wages rose sharply. For farmers in particular, the plague's outbreak and its end were a turning point that drastically altered their lives. Farmers, who had been tied to the land and exploited like slaves, were suddenly presented with an opportunity to become wealthy. With rising wages and improved diets, people freed from malnutrition became healthier and lived longer. Furthermore, some even struck it rich. According to Florentine records, after the plague ended, those who could obtain any kind of cloth or find raw materials for cloth became wealthy. Also, among the survivors, many inherited substantial wealth from deceased family members. People who had previously owned nothing suddenly became very rich. Thus, having changed from the terror and economic crisis of the plague, the number of people possessing many clothes and other assets began to increase. The lives of those who had been socially low and poor before the plague began to improve due to its outbreak and subsequent end. However, some people didn't find this situation amusing. These were the rulers, who originally held high social status. It's only natural that laborers, who had lived in poverty until then, would demand high wages and want to improve their living standards at this opportunity, right? Conversely, many rulers, wealthy landowners, tried to protect their positions and wealth, and intended to keep the laborers working for low wages. Thus, after the fight against the plague, a fight between the rulers and the laborers began. In England, first, the government argued that laborers who wouldn't work unless they received decent wages should be disciplined. In 1349, they created a truly one-sided law. It froze laborious wages at the 1346 level, before the plague. Furthermore, in 1351, the Statute of Labourers made it illegal for healthy people not to work. As a result, laborers who demanded high wages were imprisoned, and sometimes even branded. That's way too harsh a punishment just for demanding a raise, isn't it? In such an unfair world, peasants couldn't stay silent. In England, demands for higher wages and better treatment by the peasants grew stronger. But instead of listening to the peasants' pleas, the government imposed yet another tax around 1380, further fueling the peasants' anger. In 1381, a rebellion called Wat Tyler's Rebellion broke out. Led mainly by peasants, they demanded the abolition of serfdom, the system that tied them to the land. This rebellion spread throughout England. The king initially accepted their demands and promised reforms, but quickly retracted them and suppressed the rebellion by force, resulting in many deaths. This rebellion didn't directly lead to the reform of the class system, but peasant wages continued to rise. By the 15th century, serfdom in England had finally disappeared. Jean Froissart's chronicles of the time record that the rebellion was caused by the peasants' wealth and prosperity, and that rising wages and living standards fueled their demands for greater rights. The drastic population decline caused by the plague was a major turning point in European social structures. Before the plague, Europe's population had been growing, peasant wages were low, and their lives were barely sustainable. They were bound by a class system, serfdom, that allowed some to amass wealth while keeping many in poverty. This system might have lasted much longer without the plague. Those suffering from hunger would have continued to have short lifespans, and commoners would likely never have gained access to political power monopolized by the elite. Without the plague, European history might have been completely different. The plague devastated Europe and caused immense suffering, but it also became a catalyst for the relief of those who had been oppressed by the unfair and unequal class system. The plague didn't just wipe out the old world, it shook something much bigger. Before the plague hit Europe, there was something besides rules and the wealthy that held immense power: the church. Back then, people believed faith and piety brought salvation, giving the church incredible authority. But the church was completely powerless against the plague. It seems obvious to us now, but praying in church didn't stop the infection. Even the clergy, supposedly closest to God, were dropping like flies. Wait, I thought believing in God meant salvation? The church always said so. This isn't what they said. Doubt started to bloom in people who'd always believed absolutely in the power of religion. And that shift in values, caused by the plague, eventually led to something else. The Renaissance, starting in Italy in the late 14th century, is strongly associated with famous artworks like the Mona Lisa. But the truth is, the plague had a huge impact on this famous Renaissance. Before, society was unfair, with a rigid class system and the church dominating people. Then the plague ravaged cities, destroying decent living. The Renaissance movement was about escaping that dark age, reclaiming freedom of wages and dignity. Petrarch, a key figure in the Renaissance and considered the first humanist, called the 14th century, his own time, the worst in human history. In his asterisk letter to posterity asterisk, he wrote, "Our age constantly fills me with disgust. If it weren't for the love of my close friends, I would have wished to be born in a different age." Having experienced such a terrible time, people strived for a new, better era. The plague was a tragedy that took far too many lives. But afterwards, it led to significant advancements not only in social structures like the class system and the economy, but also in thought and culture. It's far too serious an infection to call it a blessing in disguise, but the plague's prevalence was incredibly important in shaping later history. Looking at it long term, the plague's widespread outbreak even led to the solution of a social problem. Now then, how was the plague itself overcome? Well, that wasn't easy. Right after the plague broke out in the 14th century, Europe tried to figure out its cause. It's only natural that people would want to know what caused a disease that killed so many. But back then, science was still underdeveloped. So, what was thought to be the cause of the plague in those days? Boccaccio, an Italian writer who actually experienced the plague's outbreak, recorded detailed explanations. One of them was the celestial origin theory, that epidemics were inflicted on humanity by the influence of celestial bodies. There were ideas that comets caused the disease, or that it was due to the influence of solar or lunar eclipses. The 14th century was still a time when the geocentric theory was believed, and the movements of celestial bodies and astronomical phenomena were shrouded in mystery. The idea was that there must be a connection between mysterious celestial phenomena and mysterious diseases. Surprisingly, among those who advocated this celestial origin theory were doctors at the University of Paris, some of the most learned in Europe. Also, there was support for the theory that epidemics spread through bad, poisonous air. And there was even a theory that this bad air was released from the ground by earthquakes. Earthquakes were also mysterious natural phenomena at the time. They must have imagined a terrifying poisonous gas being released. And the most popular explanation for all these causes was divine wrath. Like I said before, in a time when religion held immense power, the idea that God was punishing Europeans for their immoral behavior was the most widely accepted. Back then, with many natural phenomena unexplained scientifically, inexplicable events were generally attributed to God's will. However, the Church, supposedly connected to this God, did nothing to stop the plague, which shook people's faith. So, while the plague was largely unknown to people at the time, even they understood, at least, that it was contagious. People racked their brains trying to prevent it. For example, those who believed that poisonous air spread the disease thought that avoiding bad air was the key. So, to keep away bad air and smell good, carrying perfume bottles on their belts and applying vinegar, believed to remove bad air, became popular. This method was apparently used for centuries in Europe after the plague. Of course, perfume and regular vinegar had no real preventative effect. Sadly, it probably just made people feel a little better, nothing more. But no matter how useless, it was far better than the preventative measures I'm about to tell you about. Around the 16th and early 17th centuries, about 250 years after the plague began, some truly awful preventative methods appeared. It was about carrying arsenic and mercury. It's quite the dangerous things there. Arsenic and mercury are both harmful substances to the human body. And instead of preventing illness, they'd cause poisoning and have negative effects. This preventative method of carrying around a bag of arsenic and mercury medals was thought up by the Italian nobleman Antonio de Medici. Apparently, he was someone who studied alchemy. But from the perspective of modern science, it's an unbelievable preventative method. Carrying around such poisonous substances. I'd rather be scammed into buying a magical cure-all pot. Also, among the people who survived the plague, with its unclear causes and preventative measures, even more unfortunate things happened. Apparently, besides the actual plague, a really strange disease called the dancing plague broke out. This disease involved dancing uncontrollably for hours, even days. They say people groaned, cried out that they couldn't stop dancing, and kept dancing until they collapsed. This dancing plague reportedly occurred many times in areas like Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It's unclear exactly whether there were any deaths, and there are various theories about the cause, but the leading one is mass hysteria. One historian says the cause of the dancing plague was intense mental anguish, a mass hysteria where fear and panic spread contagiously. The dancing plague occurred around the time rumors of a third plague outbreak started, after the second major plague outbreak in 1374. It's thought to have been a phenomenon resulting from the mental strain on people repeatedly attacked by terrifying infectious diseases. Like that, people could only fear the plague, and their suffering went on for a long time. They attributed it to natural phenomena, feared God, or despaired of God. Today, we know scientifically that doing such things wouldn't help at all. Naturally, medical advancements couldn't keep up. There are even records saying that because doctors died just like everyone else, there was no one to research the plague. I wonder when this battle against the disease will end, and how it will end. It's utterly disheartening. It wasn't as if people back then had absolutely no means at all. Actually, even amidst this terrible situation, effective methods were found to prevent the spread of disease. These methods, still used today to control the spread of infectious diseases, were quarantine and isolation systems. In 1374, Venice experimentally implemented a system to isolate plague patients from healthy people. Also, in 1443, they imposed a 40-day quarantine on visitors from the Eastern Mediterranean, where the plague was prevalent at the time. This became known as quarantina, the origin of the English word quarantine. Eventually, in Europe, warning signs called plague signs were posted on the doors of houses infected with the plague, urging healthy people to stay away. Doctors also developed new uniforms that covered them from head to toe, protecting them from infection. These methods apparently helped reduce the damage from later outbreaks. We should express our gratitude to the people of that time who created systems still in use today. The plague, which claimed countless lives, was a devastating disaster, needless to say the worst tragedy for those who lived through it. But, overcoming that tragedy, people built a new world. As part of history in the making, we want to learn from the life force of those who came before. The history of the world is still shrouded in mystery. Let's continue our journey together, peering into the world's mysteries. See you on our next journey. Thank you for watching.